welcome to the session from wherever you are. As we gather today, we acknowledge the people of the lands on which we're sitting. I myself am on Wiradjuri country in Mudgee. And so as we gather, I acknowledge the people of the Wiradjuri land, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I'm sitting today. And if you would like, please put where you're sitting into the chat. That way we become aware of where we're all coming from. As we meet as well, we acknowledge the ways of learning across all of those different lands and pay respect to those who've helped others to learn and continue to do so today and into the future. As we met last year and were planning the events that we wanted to present across the New South Wales branch for 2022, we listened to what people had suggested when there was an initial launch of the branch at the end of last year. There were a number of ideas that came out about talking together, sharing, collegial discussion, and I think all related to the fact that we've all been so isolated, but also recognising the need of teachers to talk with each other and share practice. And that was quite evident through the survey that went out. Out of that survey emerged the concept of yarning our practice, which is our session today, yarning and storytelling as a way of sharing practice and as a way of learning from each other. So I'm delighted today to introduce you to Lloyd Dolan, who is our Acting Indigenous Curriculum Advisor and an educational designer within the Division of Learning and Teaching here at Charles Sturt University. Lloyd is going to lead us through the session this afternoon. In truth, I'm not going to say much more because Lloyd is there waiting, and he will bring us so much information and insight for the next hour or so that I don't want to waste any more time before getting to him. So thank you so much, Lloyd, and we look forward to what you're going to teach us today.
Thanks, Denise. So what I want to do to start out with is do my acknowledgement. So how I do it is Ngwambanadu Ninyugin in Nangira, Yuandu Lloyd Dolan, Kadang Narandray Malian Kirawa, or Radri, Nado Gubara Main Gearbang, Berandi Radri Nurambangir, Balanado Yinjamaniju, Berandi Main Merdable Yalabu Gerabu, Balanado Main Guwao Nurambang Galang. So rough translation is what you'll see on the screen. And so I acknowledge that I'm sitting on and coming to you from Wiradjuri lands today, but I also acknowledge all the different nations and the lands that we're sitting on as well. So Mangawal means people other. And so when I'm talking, it's other than Wiradjuri, so it acknowledges all nations that might be with us today. So how the session's sort of planned, and I sort of throw everything up in the air every time I have one of these, because it's not about me sitting here talking to you for the next hour and a half or hour session. You know, as we go through and as we talk about things, if you have questions, I'd rather people stop and we answer those as we go through. Because sometimes, and I know I do it myself, I'll go to presentations and I think, oh, I should ask. And then when it comes time to the Q&A, I've often forgot what the question was. So I'd rather people do that as we go through. And it's more reflective of that whole yarning process. It's not about waiting to the end and having a Q&A session. So even though we do have some time allocated for that later, I tend to be a bit more flexible, and that works better if we have those conversations as we're going through. We do also have a short breakout session. We're going to split you up. We have a couple of topics that we want you to think about in terms of yarning and a process. And so we always start out these sessions and we talk about that cultural safety and cultural respect. And so part of this is, and I always say to people, it's a culturally safe space. So it's a space that allows people to ask questions. And sometimes we have these sessions and people go, oh, I want to ask this, but I'm not sure how to ask it and whether I'm going to say it in the right way, not offend somebody. You know, we throw it out that it's culturally safe. And what that allows people to do is to ask those questions rather than sit with them. So the use of yarning circles or dialogue circles it's an important process within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. It's been used by First Nations peoples from around the world for centuries to learn from a collective group, to build respectful relationships, preserve and pass on cultural knowledge. So we talk about it in cultural knowledge is knowledge. Because when you think about First Nations people, the environment, the people, the atmosphere, the subterranean, it's all collective. You are part of it as a whole. You're not separated into individual boxes or sections. It's one. So the cultural safety is what we're talking about, is that space and that environment safe for Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander peoples. There's no assault, challenge or denial of identity and experiences. And it's about valuing experiences. So we all have different experiences, and it's how we actually respect those. So at Charles Sturt, we've adopted Yinjimarra Wanangana, which is about respectfully living and creating a world worth living in. So Yinjimarra for us in Wiradjuri kind of translates as English, and it's a verb. So it's a transitive verb, means that it's actions you do towards others. So it's about respect, it's about honour, it's about politeness, it's about being careful, and it's about gentleness. But it's bringing all those together into our actions, and it's getting us to reflect on our own actions and asking us, are we doing this towards others? Are we being honourable and respectful? Are we being careful and gentle in our approach? So when I talk, I generally talk from my experiences, my point of view, and that Wiradjuri. I don't talk on behalf of all First Nations people in Australia, all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I share my experiences. So for me, I've spent 30 years this year in education. I was working it out the other day. So initially came from a nursing background into education, and have been with the TAFE sector before coming to Charles Sturt 11 years ago now. I've been in multiple roles. So when we're talking about yarning and yarning circles, there's all different approaches. Often people will see the word and think there's one approach, and it's not. Just as people are culturally diverse, so are the approaches that different groups and communities use. And so I've given you some examples here around what people see as processes of yarning and what it actually means. So, some of them have, like in Besarab, it's social yarning, collaborative yarning, research yarning, and therapeutic yarning, where Dunleavy talks about an opportunity to speak in a safe, non-judgmental place and to share strengths in an inclusive way. Always focused on strengths, not problem solving or criticisms. And Lynn Green, again, social yarning is about building relationships and trust. It's diagnostic yarn, which is about information gathering, and management yarning, using stories and metaphors as tools of understanding. So part of what we've got to think about is when we're talking and we might want to run or have a yarning session, it's what is the purpose of the yarning session? So when most communities come together, we have that social yarning. And it always starts, a lot of our workshops, a lot of our gatherings is around the social yarning. It's about rebuilding our relationships, our connections, understanding who people are and where they fit into our world. And one of the keys in all of the yarning circles and the articles that you might come across, people always talk about, it's about building relationships and trust is a key. And when we think about how we use this in our teaching practices, if we're thinking about we want to have a yarning process or a yarning circle with our students, have we actually built a relationship and trust with the students to hold that circle or to hold that space? And sometimes that's our challenge. How do we build that? And we'll do it, often part of our educational focus will say we want peer-to-peer engagement, we want peer-to-peer learning. But then I ask people as the academic and the teacher and going, have you actually set up a space that allows that to happen through the relationship? So have you given students the opportunity to build relationships with each other? Do they have a trust and a space to be able to have that conversation or have that engagement? So this becomes our challenges of thinking about, if we want to adopt practices, what does it actually mean? How do we apply it? And so you can hear it will take time. And often we see this process works out, particularly around election time. this year's been a little bit different due to COVID and restrictions, but generally around elections, you'll have politicians come out to communities and do the photo ops and meet community. Now, often they will travel with an executive assistant or an assistant. And when they're introducing themselves to communities, and we do it a lot as well, here's my qualifications, here's my job, here's my role. And that's nice, but that's effective in the organisation I work. How does that relate to me as a community member? So when people are introducing themselves, and then we have the executive assistant or assistant introduces themselves, they'll often give us that personal relationship. I'm a mum, I've got 3 kids, they're in primary school, and that's what people connect, and they can build that relationship. When you spent 20 years in politics and you've been the minister for this and the minister for that, how do I connect and build that connection with you? I don't see any connection that we have in that space. So this is our challenges we're thinking about, particularly for us as staff and teachers, when we want to engage with students. What is it we're actually giving them? Is it our qualifications and our list of acronyms that follow our name? Is it about us? And how do we build that relationship? So how do students build a relationship with a series of acronyms at the end of your name? What does that actually mean for them? How do they connect with that? But sharing experiences, I've been 20 years in nursing or 15 years in this profession, and here's the experiences I've had, is a lot more relatable. And it's a way of building those relationships. Yarning circles are a little bit different. So yarning circles are more structured, and it's often be called and related to as the yarning circle because participants often sit in a circle. So in a Zoom session, we've seen people go one by one through the screen and ask people to have input and reflect and do practices. It's more of that structured. So it's an introduction to the group. There's often a focus question or a structure, and it's around sharing thoughts and ideas around that focus question. And then there's time for reflection and discussion. So it becomes a little bit more complicated because you've got to think about, if we're going to have a yarning circle, then the expectation of a yarning circle is that all participants will engage and they will have input. Where yarning itself is more open-ended. So you might still have a focus question or a topic, and it could be around reconciliation. And it's about getting people to share their understanding, their experiences of what that actually means to them. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the yarning space as a learning space, but then also as a research space. So we're seeing yarning used more in research. So one of the interesting ones I look at is Palmer in his text, The Courage to Teach, exploring the inner landscape of a teacher's life. Why I tend to lean towards Palmer as a First Nations person, we'll often ask ourselves, what am I teaching? When am I teaching it? How am I doing it? And who? Sometimes, they're the first questions we always tend to ask. What we do as Indigenous people is firstly think about who is the person doing the teaching? Who are you as the person doing the teaching? What do you actually bring? What's your stance? What's your standpoint? What's your view? What's important to you in your teaching and delivery? And I see this come out a lot with some of our staff we work with, and as an educational designer, I work with staff and around their subject sites. And they go, well, students normally only engage for the first 5 or 6 weeks. So that's where I need to spend most of my time on the I2 site to get them to engage in that first 5 to 6 weeks. And what I say to that academic is, you've already positioned your students not to engage past that point. So therefore, you've set up your learning. As a student, I don't need to learn past that point. So it then gets them to question and ask themselves, hang on, how do I actually get them to engage past the 6 weeks into the rest of the subject and into the content, rather than try to push everything into the first 6 weeks? So it's getting us to think about, and what Parker Palmer does is gets us to think about and reflect about who we are as the teachers and what are we actually bringing to the space. And you can see on page 76, he outlined similar rules around the yarning space. There are still rules. It's bounded, yet open. So it's open to many paths, many discussions, but there's a destination in mind. It's hospitable, charged, so it's open, safe, free, trustworthy. Invites the voice of the individual and the voice of the group. It should honour little stories of students and the big stories of discipline and tradition. It's about bringing those two together. And when we think about what we're doing with a lot of our students, it's engaging them for their professions, for their disciplines. It should support solitude, but also have resources of community, time to learn, ideas tested, biases challenged, seeing barriers and pathways. And it's interesting that he also talks about welcome both silence and speech. Time to reflect on what we've said, what we've heard, and silence itself can be speech. Thinking about the reactions of people in our groups. And some of the stuff I was reading around this, there's a common 15-second break in silence because people feel a need to fill that silence. And Peter Garrett talked about it when he worked with elders in Nhulunbuy. So, they went to the beach and he was engaging with community. And the elders looked and they're sitting on the beach and he said, tide's coming in. He sat. He said he learned so much that day. The next spoken words were tides going out. That was the extent of the conversation in words that was used all day. So what it's really getting to think about who we are, but in part of First Nations and how I think about my teaching is, as a teacher, I'm not separated from the learner, but seen as a whole person, influenced and operating within the inside and outside way of being, seeing, knowing, and doing. It's about how do we actually get students to engage in their whole senses as well, as part of that collective. And it's an interesting quote that he puts up and goes, there were 30 students in that classroom. It is possible that 29 of them were ready to learn, but I'll never know. Or in the back row in the far corner slouched the spectre called the student from help. And so what he was talking about in reflecting on that experience is saying he spent so much time worried about that one student, he forgot about the other 29 that were in the group and ready to learn. His focus shifted away from teaching students to on that one student. So the yarning space in the research space is a little bit different. Barlow and others talked about 6 main protocols for setting up a research space for yarning. Again, there's still rules, there's still boundaries, and it's about selecting the appropriate yarning method. So are you talking about a yarning circle? You're talking about it for information gathering, you're talking about it. So you actually need to be clear about why you're there. If the first session that you often held with community and with people and even with our students is around the relationship building, well, that's what the session's about. So then you don't try and jump in and throw in research questions and topics. And it's about building those connections and relationships. So what they talk about is this, it's talking about a gift, offer their knowledge. When this knowledge is accepted and valued, the gift is considered to be received. The participants and not the researcher determines the length of the yarn, and once begun, its overall direction. Determines in what form will proceed, such as talking, dancing, drawing. Freedom, the space itself, going to consider the physical space. Inclusiveness, gender specificity, specificity, I can't say that word today, even one of those days. Personal characteristics of those who are present. So, there are those culture and gender issues that you may come across working with First Nations communities about men and women's business. And so your topic then may be affected by the gender issues that might come up. I was talking to one of our students the other day, who's a staff member, and he was talking about a program that they take students to Western Australia. And I asked him that question about, do you actually have this conversation with your students who are going into those communities and what issues they may find as a young, female veterinary student going into communities to work, but the men won't talk to her or won't engage with her because of a gender. How does she actually deal with that as a student? Have you actually set students up to be able to work in that space? So it's being aware of those issues that might come up. Now here's a couple of experiences that I'll share with you. So this is a conversation that took place between learners. We took some elders out with a group from Environment and Heritage out into the national park. When we got back, we had a conversation. Always had that debrief. So I said to them, what did you think of today's activity with the elders? And one of the persons went, it was interesting being out on country and talking to elders, but it would have been better not to hear them talk about the things they did as children out in the bush. Then somebody else said, but I learned so much from the elders today. When I was listening to their stories, I was watching and looking at the bush and the land, and I realized they were actually giving us a map to make our way to the mountain ridge. Well, what do you mean? To access the ridge they were referring to, we currently use a helicopter. Now we know a way to get there from the base of the ridge by foot. And so it's about how we actually accept the information that's presented to us as well. What do we actually see from it? So when the elders were talking, they didn't stop everybody and go, right, now we're going to give you a map of how to get from here to the ridge line. They told they actually engaged in that yarning process between themselves, and the information was there. And part of our teaching processes is that's how we deal with information. We give people information. Are they ready to understand the meaning? Is going to depend on where that person's at in their experiences, where they're at in their life. One of the other ones I use sharing stories. So I share one of our stories, Wurra and the giant kangaroos. And then I get, we get people to write down what they think it's about. We come together as a collective and throw all those up on a whiteboard or on a notice board. And then people share their understandings. And so on the screen, you can see a couple of different things that came out of the same story. So, people talking about it being from the stolen generations. They saw the kangaroos as coming in and taking away the children. Somebody else who was a Defence Force personnel talks about it. He came from Defence Force into education. He saw it about war, about creating alliances, using techniques such as camouflage. And somebody else was talking about the roles of men and women. That same story explained to them, this is what men do, this is what women do, this is their role in the community. So when we talk about the story, we talk about how that one story has multiple levels or multiple meanings that's based on your understanding of the world. So when we're having those yarning sessions, it's about what are we listening to? What are we listening for? Are we actively listening to what's being said and discussed? Or do we have something going around in our head, planning for the next question I need to ask? Or, so we're not really taking on the information that's being provided. We might nod, we might agree, but we're not really listening because we're planning where we're going in our head. One of the interesting ones I always do is lots of groups. We talk about community issues, community politics, and lots of people don't want to go there because some of these areas can be contentious and quite challenging to deal with. So we bring up this idea around community issues in community organisations, and often we'll get the responses are, but they're filled with nepotism. They're not doing what they're meant to be. It's all made up from same people, from the government departments that are working there. We don't get a say as community. And, get them to think about, okay, so what needs to happen? And conversations always start out with, oh, they are doing this. They need to do this. And then what I tend to get students to do is then think about who are they as members of the community? And then I get them to go, well, hang on, you are the community. You are a member of that organisation. So when you're saying they, are you referring to yourself? So then I get them to think about saying, well, hang on, you're saying this needs to happen. And then I get them to think about, well, what are you doing to change that situation? What's your role in it? So they're not excluded from the whole process of what's happening in the community. They are part of the community. Getting them to reflect again that they are members of that community. And in Wiradjuri, we talk about a couple of different aspects. You can't change the past. The language itself, no language allows you to talk about the past and change what happened. The future is always talked about in possibilities and never certainties. The future can change, and it's open to change. And each person, item, or thing is always talked about in terms of their own qualities. You cannot directly contrast. So in English, we say, he's smarter than her, or he's faster than him. In language, in most Aboriginal languages, you can't do that. You actually have to talk about what are the qualities that individual people bring. So if we're comparing, heights of two people, we might say, Dad is tall and Mum is short, but it's about they both have different qualities. We don't directly compare two, which is a bit of a challenge when we think about language we use. When we think about those components that we talked about, and I talk with counselling students, they go, yep, often we'll say, but you're having a counselling session and you say to students, and you're teaching them the process, then you might say, well, what could you have done differently? Now, when you're talking to First Nations people, you go, well, nothing, I can't change it. So why are you asking me a question that I can't change? So often you won't get a positive response. You might get some blank looks, some blank stares, because culturally, it's not something you can do. If you talked about it in future possibilities and shifting that and saying, if this was to happen again in the future, how could you handle it differently? How could you react differently? What could you do then, rather than changing what you did in the past? So even though it seems like a small change, it's a different way of thinking culturally, and it's a different approach, because it's not locking me into certainties in the future, it's possibilities. Any questions? It's a lot of information to take on. All happy? Yeah. Now we're going to have some breakout rooms. Denise, have we got those set up?
No. In the background, yes.
Yep.
Yep. Now, rather than just throw you into that space, because one of the interesting things what Parker talks about when he's talking about the learning space is saying, people always think about that open-ended learning space, and what he talks about is saying a learning space or any space without boundaries, without limits, is a black hole. That's how it works. He said you still need boundaries. So what I want you to think about in your breakout room, I've given you a couple of little things. Think about how you could use yarning processes in your teaching and learning, or it could be in research. And here's a couple of topics that you might want to think about and think, right, how could I actually use yarning as a process to think about Reconciliation Week, NAIDOC Week, and the two themes that, be brave, make change, or get up, stand up, show up. How could you actually have that yarning process or discussions with your students around these topics? So we want you to sort of yourselves have those sort of yarns, sharing, open sharing of ideas, not a right or a wrong. Yeah. And it is about the challenges. How do you connect students to these ideas rather than being an abstract? Yeah. We're going to put people into rooms.
Thank you. And that looks like that's everybody back. I'm not sure if you have any more that you'd like to say, Lloyd, but certainly this last sort of 15, 20 minutes of our session was about sharing about what you've heard, but also what you've experienced. And I guess giving you a chance to add any more extra insights or thoughts, Lloyd, from where you were there. So this is open microphone time. What have you experienced? What are you thinking about? Michelle.
Sure, I'll go. Did I wait 15 seconds?
I knew people were going to do that.
I was thinking the same thing.
You know that I have a background working in radio, and so my natural default is just to talk. If there's a silence, it's just to talk. Thank you very much, Lloyd. Thanks so much. So much thinking there. I was just in a great group, and we were talking, about some ideas from from different perspectives. But the things that have really resonated for me is creating that safe space in the classroom, and how I might be able to do that to generate conversation around the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So, Lloyd, you might remember that I introduced the Uluru Statement from the Heart as a case study for an assessment task in a brand new subject in the new BCom. And this was the first time that, we ran that. I think the assessment task worked really well, Lloyd. But upon reflection, I don't think that there was enough kind of conversation around it. And so I've really identified that yarning would be, I think, an approach that I could bring into the classroom to start generating some conversations around the statement in preparation for students completing that assessment task.
So sort of preparation towards it, Michelle, where you're building their sense of understanding so that then they can complete the task.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Narelle's got a hand up.
Oh, sorry, Narelle.
That's fine. Thank you, Lloyd. Thank you for your presentation. It was fantastic, and certainly our group, everything you said resonated with us. I think one of the things that I took away from our group was when looking at using the principles of yarning, the importance of space and constructing space, and being able to innovatively think about how we use space if we're wanting to establish a yarning circle. And in our group, we were talking about, varied spaces from like a library space. How would you do that in a library to set up a yarning circle that might need to run across time? So not just what those boundaries for the yarning circle, I guess, would be, and if people can come in and out of the circle and those sorts of things. Also for doing the same sort of thing if you're teaching online and you've got asynchronous teaching again, so people might be coming in and out, and how you create that safe space. And then I did share a story of the impact of physical space with a group that I'd been teaching many years ago, where I had problems establishing safe space and respectful conversations amongst the students. And one day I just happened to find them sunning themselves in the afternoon, reluctant to go into the tutorial room until I arrived. And I said to them, would they like to have the class outside? And thinking that they would sit under the trees where they were on proper seats, they all were really enthusiastic and said, yes, we'd love to. And I said, great, where would you like to sit? And anyone who knows the Albury campus, there's a little hill up on the Cliff Blake. They wanted to sit on top of that. And I said, okay, that's fine. you know, and it was amazing because they were surprised. You know, I could hear them talking as we were walking up there, and they were saying things like, I didn't know we were allowed up here, but Narelle's with us, so we can't get into trouble. So they were really excited by that space. And because it was just grassy, it was on top of the hill, they just sat in a circle on the grass. And it was the best tutorial session we'd had. So, you know, I was just reflecting on the impact that the physical space had on the students being able to connect and a bit like a yarning circle, talk about their experiences and their ideas and their thoughts. So that impact of physical space was interesting.
Across the group, is there anyone else that's had an unusual space, just as Narelle's spoken about, like where it's been quite surprising how much the students have changed in their approach or their feeling of being able to talk easily?
Denise, I might just jump in. I've got another one that really springs to mind. I used to do this every year with first year students. We had what we call in a tutorial session a pajama party. And what it was because we were talking about how you would do exercises with patients in bed, and the fact that when patients are in bed they're wearing pajamas, and pajamas, you know, are difficult to maintain modesty and all of this. So I would get the students to wear pajamas. Of course, the boys were always very smart and said to me, we don't wear pajamas. So I had a set of old lady nighties for them to put on instead. So it was really quite hilarious, and they were very good natured about it all, and they did don these clothes, or else a hospital gown, but they had to have something on that would replicate what a patient wore in hospital, and that made a huge difference. That was a great session, and the students always were really relaxed, most engaged in doing things. And, you know, I can still have visions of the boys clutching their nighties to try and, you know, when the girls are lifting up their legs to do exercises or move them around. And they certainly learned a lot, but so not necessarily a yarning, but it was great that it engaged the students, and they became more relaxed and comfortable. And I think a little bit of that is that they learned a little bit more about me, because I actually had pajamas on. I did put my pajamas on over my clothes. I didn't just go straight to the pajamas. But I think, you know, that there is that level of then that was a much more even playing field.
Yeah. Michelle, I can see your hands up again.
I was just thinking then, hearing about the pajamas, that there's also in the fields that I teach into, so media, it's not there are not safe spaces as well, and so in incorporating a safe space in the teaching place, and our subjects and our courses are really industry focused, and we use kind of professional practice in our teaching spaces. So that means that there's microphones and cameras in our teaching spaces. And so, you know, being on the radio is not a safe space to be, you know, to share everything. And so I guess for me, it's just really, if I'm creating safe spaces for students to share, that I'm also, you know, maintaining that the professional practice of being in the media is not a safe space. And we know that social media in particular is not a safe space. So that's something that just came to my mind as well, is, you know, guiding students through that as well.
Could I say something or add something to what Michelle just said? I work with performers, with singers, and it is a scary place. to be on stage in front of 1,000 people and being judged for everything. So I think the teaching studio for that needs to be the safe space. And it takes a while for young students to realize that the teaching studio is the space where they are encouraged to make every possible mistake they will ever or could ever make. So they have that experience and learn to deal with this. And then we do try to find a safe space on the stage, which is different to engaging with social media or having like talkback or anything like this. But because it is, we do know pretty much what the performance is about, we can guide that more. But the vulnerability and how to deal with that is takes a lot of courage, and to realize that the best that can happen sometimes is to horribly fail, because then the fear is gone and what else can happen to you. And then often there is actually a sense of freedom there to stand up, so what, I'm here. And just that the space, then the safe space, is to be present in there. But it's difficult, and it remains difficult. And what resonated me with Lloyd very much at the beginning is that the teacher, the people the students meet are as important as the stuff that they teach about. So that being vulnerable by example, failing and not shying away from telling it, or showing that one can be heard, not having all of the answers. I think this is something that's always difficult, but it also feels great the few times when we get it right. So I think that learning by doing is, and this is something that stays, I think, and it's a challenge for me constantly as a teacher too, to realize I don't have all the answers, although I want to, go out and rescue them and all. It's not they have to rescue themselves, but there you go. That's sort of what comes to mind for me at the moment.
One of the ways that I think you might take away and think through this is as Anka's just saying, our own identity, our own vulnerabilities as teachers. So often we do feel that we have to be in control and managing it all, and it has to work properly. But being able to work alongside students and to be that vulnerable person too, and recognize, look, I don't know it, let's find that out together, goes a long way towards that co-learning, doesn't it? That sense of we will learn from them as they will learn from us. And one of the mandates for me always is, if I'm teaching and I'm not learning, I shouldn't be teaching anymore. So that reciprocity of the teaching learning process is important for us to stay in that, in a role of a teacher who is able to facilitate learning. Lloyd, we've got about 15 minutes, and I do want to talk briefly about how we get this recording out to you. But Lloyd, is there anything that you'd like to say to wrap this all up?
No, have fun, don't panic. And we'll often have that challenge around time. That's part of what happens in workloads. And like you're saying, Denise, and that's what I always do. I always think, okay, what can I learn from this experience as well, and reflecting on it. And even in our room, like when we were having the conversation, somebody was talking about something, and I went, until I just said that then, I'd never actually thought about them. Actually, when I work with academic staff, as part of that process, I'm actually using the yarning process. I'm getting to know the connections, the experiences, how I connect with them to build that trust to help them do their role. So those experiences come from everywhere and anywhere. And sometimes we use it, we don't necessarily recognize that we are actually using that process.
Yeah, that reminds me of a conversation I had this morning with someone who said, oh, it's so interesting to talk with you. When did you work out what sort of a teacher you were? And I thought, I actually don't remember. I just remember it emerging that this is what here's what I do and this is why I do it. And there's that same core thing always in the center of what we're doing. There might be things around the edges that change, but that belief about learning and teaching is central and is core all the time. Thank you, everybody. Anka, is there anything that you would like to add in as the events person within the Herzer branch?
As the events person, I would like to thank everybody. It's probably, I'm not the official person, but I would like from the bottom of my heart, thank you all for coming, especially at this short notice. And I would like to thank Lloyd and Denise. And I have to say that after today, I feel inspired. And so I've recharged my batteries. And it reminded me why I love teaching. And so thank you to everybody. I hope we can meet again. And so I will spread the word, Lloyd and Denise. So I hope you get a few more invitations somewhere. But so it was just fantastic. And also as a non-Indigenous person, I am often conflicted about what can I do, because I didn't grow up in Australia. I came from Germany. And so I am totally outraged at what happened in the past, but I'm in the present and I sometimes don't know what can I do, what can't I do, and actually it just showed again, you know, the ideas of roundtables, of communicating. It's about people being decent and giving other people space. And so I feel quite humbled also to have been let into this world. So thank you for this as well.
And I think I've just put the copy of the PowerPoint in the chat.
Okay, fantastic.
Took me a while to work out how to do that, but I worked it out.
But you've done it. Well done. See, there's something you've learned. Thank you, Lloyd, for the time and thought and the passion that you provided us this afternoon and just for sharing your view of things. Thank you, Saeed, for all of the background, connecting up with people and getting things organised. And thank you all for your time this afternoon. And I do hope that you're going away feeling energised and reminded of what it is that we're about. And I hope that you have a lovely day and a lovely rest of the week. But thanks, everybody.
Right, thank you.
Bye-bye.